Hey guys, good morning. Sorry we didn't get through everything in class yesterday. I was really pleased with the work that you guys did on the creation and flood stories and the creation debate prep. I really wanted to do a little more actual debating and we ran short on time, so I apologize for that. But I hope it was helpful activity for you, and please keep in mind that the more you prepare and the more you invest time in getting ready for this class, the more you're going to get out of it and the more your classmates will as well. You all have something really special to bring, and I appreciate that. Okay, so I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to set you up for what you're going to be starting to read this week. The Children's Homer. My copy looks like this. Your copy may look different. This is an old one by a man named Padraig Colum. He's an Irish writer. He wrote this in 1918 as a way for, it says children, but really it's written, I think, for anybody to appreciate the stories of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This is a copy of Homer's Odyssey. This is all one poem. Not even kidding. Books and books and books of a poem. And so he's retold this story and the Iliad, which I don't have a copy of, in this book in prose form. There's a few things that I want to let you know before you get in there, because it's going to be throwing a lot of stuff at you, a lot of names, a lot of gods, a lot of heroes, a lot of different things, and you're going to have to work to keep track, but a little perspective will help. The two stories, the Iliad, which comes first, and then the Odyssey, tell stories related to the Trojan War. You've probably heard about the Trojan War, but you may not know much about it. You may know about the horse, and it's in here. It's all in here. But the Trojan War and its aftermath. The Trojan War, we think, was probably an actual war or a series of wars that took place around 1300 BC. Now, a quick note, you will see the terms BC and BCE to talk about dates prior to the birth of Christ. BC really means before Christ, but historians who now want to kind of maybe not reference Jesus, partly maybe because they have anti-Christian feelings, but also maybe just because they are uncomfortable in a secular context making Jesus' birth the pivotal moment of history, even though it is. They sometimes will say before the Common Era, BCE, and then dates after the birth of Christ often used to be called AD, which was from the Latin Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. And now those dates are often called CE, Common Era. So Common Era is just kind of a term that means we're not going to mention Jesus, but we're really still dating everything from around the time of his birth. So just so you know. Anyway, Trojan War, about 1300 BC. About the same time-ish as Moses and the Exodus, if that helps give it perspective. So the stuff's happening down in Egypt that we're going to be reading about in our history book this week with the Israelites and the Pharaoh and Exodus and the plagues and all that kind of stuff. Around the same time, within a couple hundred years or two of that, is when up in Asia Minor, now we think of as Turkey, that the Trojan War was happening. If it really happened, which we think maybe it did. The stories of the Trojan War are told in the Iliad. The Iliad is not about all of the Trojan War. It's really just about a few months toward the end of the Trojan War, and it focuses on the hero Achilles and his best friend Patroclus and his disagreement with Agamemnon. And you're gonna get part of that. But the context of the Trojan War, the reason the Trojan War started, at least according to myth. So we've got the real Trojan War that we think may or may not have happened, and then most of what we know about the Trojan War is actually stuff that's clearly mythological. But the myth behind the Trojan War is that the king of Troy, Priam, received a prophecy that his son Paris would lead to the destruction of Troy. Troy is the name of the city. The word Trojan is like an adjective from Troy. So the Trojan War is the war that happened in Troy. And so he and his wife Hecuba decide to send Paris off. As happens often in these Greek stories, kids are supposed to be killed, but then some shepherd or poor person adopts them. That's what happens with Paris. So Paris is this really prince kid, but is living like a shepherd, doesn't know he's a prince. And there's this wedding that all these gods and goddesses are at, including Hera, who is the wife of Zeus, who's always really jealous because Zeus is having lots of affairs with people. I don't really blame her. And then Athena, who's the goddess of war and wisdom, and then Aphrodite, who's the goddess of love. So they all attend this wedding, and there's this other goddess named Eris, who's the goddess of discord, of strife. And she throws what's called the apple of discord into the middle of the wedding. She's trying to stir up trouble. And the trouble that winds up getting stirred up is this. Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena decide to have a contest to decide who's the most beautiful. All right, anyone can see that this is a really bad idea. Don't have a contest between 3 goddesses, or any women ever, to try to determine who's the most beautiful. So they're asking everybody, who's gonna judge? Who's gonna decide which one of us is the prettiest, all right? And they decide that Paris, this handsome shepherd lad, is the one who should decide. And in order to persuade him to their side of the cause, they each offer him something. But Aphrodite offers him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy, who herself is a daughter of Zeus and this woman named Leda. And so Paris, being a guy, decides to go with this beautiful woman thing. And so he chooses Aphrodite as the most beautiful goddess, which really ticks off Hera and Athena. And so that's going to be really important that Athena is against Paris and doesn't like the Trojans, because she's going to side with everybody else who's against the Trojans because of what Paris did. He didn't pick her as the prettiest. And so the only problem with this whole Helen thing is that she's married already to a guy named Menelaus. So Paris abducts her and takes her off with him to Troy. He has since found out that he is actually the son of the king of Troy. And you can imagine that Menelaus is not real happy about this. He's a king of his own little kingdom. His brother Agamemnon is a king of his own little kingdom. They all have these little city-states, so there's lots of kings, which sounds confusing, but they're kings of kind of small places. They're more like mayors. And so Agamemnon agrees to avenge his brother Menelaus and the kidnapping of Menelaus' wife Helen, and gathers together this massive army of people who are all from the general area of Greece. And they call themselves the Achaeans, but we would now kind of think of them as Greeks. And they mass together and head off to Troy, and they're there for 10 years. It's a 10-year-long war, but they're not fighting all the time. They're kind of hanging out and sending messages and then fighting for a little bit and then hanging out and sending messages. So the story of the Iliad kind of picks up toward the end of the Trojan War, and you've got all these big personalities of these people, including Achilles, who's this guy who, you may know, was invincible because his mother, Thetis, who was a sea nymph, had dipped him in the river Styx, which is the river that separates the land of the living from the land of the underworld. She dipped him in there. So he's invincible because of the water covering his body when he was a baby, except for where she held him, which was by his heel. So you may have heard the term Achilles heel, or Achilles tendon even, comes from this myth. And so there's this prophecy that if he goes into battle, into the Trojan War, he's gonna die, but die a hero. If he stays away from it, he will live a long and happy life, but not have heroic experiences. So that's kind of a big thing. Is he going to be part of this? So that's all I'm going to tell you about that part of it. And then the Trojan War ends. You'll read about how, you may already know. And the end of the Trojan War actually takes place in the book that we would think of as the Odyssey. And then the Odyssey mostly is about the journey of Odysseus. His name comes in here, Odysseus, Odyssey, who's the king of an island named Ithaca, and his 10-year journey to get home after the Trojan War. And also it flashes back and forth between the situations of Odysseus and the challenges he's facing, and he's facing a lot of different challenges, and the situation back at home in Ithaca. He's got a son named Telemachus, who is now about 20 years old, who's never really known his dad, and a mother named Penelope, who's been living for 20 years trying to fend off all these suitors who assume her husband's dead and thinks she should marry one of them so they can become king of Ithaca and get all this stuff. But she's faithful to Odysseus and wants to remain so. So the way that this book is told, it kind of starts with Telemachus. It kind of starts with what happens in the Odyssey and Telemachus being in Ithaca, wondering what's happened to his dad and deciding to go off and find out. And then he encounters people along the way who tell him about what happened during the Trojan War. And then we flash back and forth between what's happening with Telemachus and what's happening with Odysseus during the same time period. So really the whole story of this book kind of takes place like in the last year of this 20-year time period, but we keep running into people who say, oh yeah, I can tell you what happened 10 years ago back in Troy, or I can tell you what happened 5 years ago back with Odysseus or whatever. So try to keep track of who is talking and telling you a particular portion of the story and when they're telling you it happened. There are clues in the book, but you have to, it's not linear. It kind of starts almost at the end and then keeps backtracking and coming forward and backtracking and coming forward and backtracking until we get to the very end where we get the resolution of the whole story when Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca and see what happens there. These books are ascribed to a man named Homer, not Homer Simpson, different Homer, who supposedly, kind of by legend, was this blind bard who lived and wrote maybe about somewhere in the 800 to 500 BC era, so several hundred years, about 400 or 500 years after the events that may or may not have happened in the Trojan War itself. But many people think that Homer never actually existed as a single person, that these stories were a compilation of different authors. And really, no matter what, we know that before they were ever written down, they had been composed and recited by poets. And so literally one guy would have memorized all of this and he would recite it. Now he would never recite it all at once. No one would want to sit and listen to that all at once, but he would maybe wander into a court or a town or whatever and he would recite portions of it and maybe in exchange for food and lodging or whatnot. And so people were intimately familiar with all the details of these stories. And not only were people in ancient Greece really familiar with the details of all these stories have shaped and molded the education, the background, the core knowledge of people for hundreds of years, really until maybe the last 50 or 60 years. These stories would have been the Bible, the Iliad, and the Odyssey would have been the three books that people knew, educated people knew pretty much everything about. And so the reason it's important for us to know these stories is a lot of things that we will read and encounter both in school and in our lives are written by people who knew this really well. So pretend, for example, that you had never seen Star Wars or any of the MCU, Marvel Universe stuff, and you tried to just kind of pop into pop culture and experience it today, and you've never even heard of those things. You wouldn't even maybe know that there were references all around you to that stuff, but you would be missing a lot. This has an even more enormous impact on culture and life and writing and art and everything, and even politics and philosophy and everything else than Star Wars and Marvel do on our current life. But Star Wars and Marvel are actually a pretty good parallel to this kind of mythic, epic, massive story with lots of characters and lots of locations and deep kind of core emotional ties and flawed characters that are still heroes that we want to root for but we're frustrated with, all of that kind of stuff, all of those things. We never would have had Marvel, we never would have had Star Wars if it hadn't been for this. This is a huge influence on all of that. So this is called an epic poem. An epic poem, an epic technically even without the word poem means a really long poem, a narrative poem, which means a story poem, a poem telling a story that goes through, talks about big events, heroes, villains, all kinds of exciting stuff. So that's an epic. And the reason it would have been in poetry and the reason it would have had very repetitive rhyme and meter is that it did have to be memorized. And if you're gonna have to memorize something that's crazy, you want as many helps as you can get. And one of the things that Homer does, or that the original composers of whoever wrote this did, is use something called an epithet, E-P-I-T-H-E-T, epithet. And that is a little phrase that connects to a name or a place that is often repeated. So every time, for example, Athena is mentioned, Homer calls her dark-eyed Athena or gray-eyed Athena, depending on how you translate it. Every time Odysseus is mentioned, he's called cunning Odysseus or skilled Odysseus. Odysseus is really known for his wits. He's really smart and kind of sneaky, really lies a lot, but he's intelligent. And Athena is his #1 champion. So even in this book, even though it's not written in poem, Padraig O'Connell uses a lot of those epithets. So that was one of the things I kind of wanted you to watch out for. All right, I think I've probably talked long enough. We will cover more in class on Wednesday. Sorry, I didn't mean for this to be a 15-minute video. I get so excited when I start talking about literature. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care, bye.